folks. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. What an honor it is to connect with somebody who had a chance to see about a week ago with Brian Dean, and he really knocked my socks off, and it's great to connect with him in person in his studio. Doc Holladay, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thanks so much, Jake. Happy to have you here.
You know, Doc, I just wanted you to talk about, it's funny, I was, right after I saw you, I went to go hang with Tower of Power. They were up in Scottsdale, and Roger Smith, who's from Sacramento, amazing B3 player, he talked to me about Larry Bradford, kind of an unsung Bay Area gem, who taught him his first extension on the B3. Do you remember how you learned your first extensions? I mean, to me, those are the cats that really get me off.
Well, let's make sure our vocabulary is straight.
Absolutely.
So when I think of extensions, I'm thinking of chord extensions. I mean, there are all kinds of extensions. There are extension chords.
We're going chordal. We're going on the B3.
But I'm thinking chord extensions where, you know, your typical blues chord is like a dominant seventh chord, and then you can play a 9. The 9th, that's an extension. There's the 11, sharp 11, and 13th. So, but that's what I think of as extensions. Now, when did I start learning about extensions?
It was just, Roger was a young cat. He would always sneak into the clubs, and he had big hands. So Larry was like, yo, you can, I mean, again, I'm not a musician, so I'm just wondering if somebody hipped that to you, or whether you just sort of, you know.
I think it mainly probably came about from, you know, through my first many years of playing, starting like early high school. It was mostly rock and blues music without too many extensions. I mean, going up to 7th chords, that's about it. Maybe a 9th every now and then if you're gonna play James Brown. But then when I started sort of getting into the subgenre of jazz that's most commonly known as soul jazz, sometimes acid jazz, it's really very similar to blues, except many of the chords are jazzier. So instead of going, you might be going. That's got that.
I love that.
That's got that 13th right there. So that's how you can kind of take the first step from becoming a blues player in like the Chicago blues style, which I lived in Chicago for about 20 years. So I got surrounded by that to some extent.
Wow.
Never became really an expert, but now here in retrospect in 2023, I realize that the period that I was there, late 70s to late 90s, and playing in a blues band up in the suburbs, but that was also a period where a lot of these great, well-known Chicago musicians, Magic Slim and Jimmy Johnson and people like that were playing around.
Like Mighty Joe Young?
Mighty Joe Young, got to see him quite a few times.
Oh my God.
Big
man.
Twist and the Mellow Fellows were sort of R&B.
What years were you there?
Late 70s till late 90s.
Dude, late 70s in Chicago. Paint that picture of even just what, were you going to the South? What was the South Side like in the late 70s? Because I've interviewed Barry Goldberg, and he talked about, you know, him and Butterfield grew up in a mixed, pretty integrated neighborhood, but for white cats, if they the stuff they were hearing on the radio, they had to go to the South Side. So him and Bloomfield would go down there. By the late 70s, what was the vibe like then?
Well, I'm sorry to say, and it was probably my ignorance when I was at
I would have been ignorant. I would have missed the boat too.
I didn't make it that often to the South Side. I would drive through on my way to my hometown to Nashville. Drive through the Dan Ryan Expressway, I remember well, into Gary, Indiana. But in terms of hanging out there, I didn't do too much. Now, partly my ignorance, because I didn't know enough to know that that was really the place to be. But I did hang out on Halstead Street, which is more on the north side.
We'll talk about. I mean, what was the talk about the vibe at that time? Because, I mean, it was still a rich, fertile music scene at that time.
So I started there in '77, which is when I moved to Chicago to go to grad school at Northwestern. So I was living in Evanston, which is the first suburb north of
Sure.
north of Chicago. So then access to Rogers Park and Halstead Street were pretty easy on the L. So I would take the L. Sometimes it was freezing cold, but I still braved it with some friends, and we'd, go down. And I'd say one of the main things I've focused on, some of my band buddies have heard me talk about this, is the way those drummers, I mean, I'd watch their backbeat, and they had such a great articulation and placement of that beat that really, I thought, was very responsible for the overall feel that's getting created.
I want to stop right there. This is
Okay.
really important. They were. Would you say that it was a floating kind of feel, like almost a feathering of the bass drum? They weren't hitting it like machine gun fire. How would you describe that feel of the music?
I'm talking about the snare drum and what I was getting out. I would watch them and say, now how, and it seems like it's just a little bit behind sometimes.
Right.
And the way it interacts with the bass player in some way just creates what I think of as the Chicago blues style. I mean, you listen to Buddy Guy records and things like that, and he's always got drummers that do that. Jimmy Johnson, I heard a lot. He had an album out.
Jimmy Johnson. I know that. That's the name of that that's Muscle Shoals Cat, but that's a different Jimmy Johnson.
Yeah. Jimmy Johnson was also a football coach, I think, for the
A
Dallas
legend.
Cowboys
Yeah, he
or
certainly
something.
was. Yes.
But the Jimmy Johnson I'm talking about was born in Mississippi, but he relocated to Chicago, I think, in the 50s, and he had an album, a really great album that different bands I've been in and covered some of the song called Barroom Preacher.
Oh yeah.
And it's got a blues standard called Little by Little on there, and You Don't Know What Love Is on that album. Anyway, so I'd go hear him a lot. He had great keyboard player, bass player, and drummer. Unfortunately, the bass player and keyboard player didn't survive an accident they had driving from a gig up in Indiana, I believe. And so, but that band that he had before that happened was just so awesome. And those are some of my best memories of hearing that band.
What about like Otis Spann? Were those cats? All the older cats were still cooking at that time.
And that could be. I think Otis Spann was Muddy Waters.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this cat. There's this one cat I'm trying to think of that it's going to come to me later.
Yeah.
Did you go to the Sutherland Lounge at all?
I remember Kingston Mines being a big one, and yeah, boy, we're going way back.
Well, no, you know what it was. You know what it is. I was born in '78, so it's beautiful that you were there in the late '70s. And I'm curious about, you talk about that Chicago sound. Where were you able to, if at all, were you able to play some of that acid jazz? Was there a place where you could play the acid jazz?
Well, that came a little bit later, because after, so I met my wife in Chicago in the late 80s, right downtown. She lived on Wrightwood Street, which was, a street off of Halstead. So going down to visit her was one of the things that made it easy to get to Halstead Street and just catch a little blues on the
Right.
But anyway, by the late 90s, we went to a Christmas party, and we wrapped up before we were getting ready to go home, came out to the car, and right together, it was amazing. We both went, we got to get out of here. And so it was really cold, so we moved to Tucson.
Bitter cold.
Yeah, we moved.
Why did you move here? It's so beautiful you moved here. Why did you choose here?
I had visited. I was here on a conference the first time, and the conference was at the U, and so I was staying in a dorm, but hung out at places down by the U, and that was cool. I saw some good music at a place that was called Cactus Moon, I think, something like that. And there was a cool B3 player there.
Really?
Who I put two and two together years later, and Lamont Arthur, who you may know.
Dude, I can't believe you just brought him up, man, because Lamont is a dear's uncle to me. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's a great.
Wait, you saw him with LAPD with Phil Davis?
I saw him at the Cactus Moon in the late in the earlier mid '80s. I think the first time I was in Tucson. Anyway, had a great experience here. Liked the cactus, liked the desert feel, and it was also, I think, end of May where it was still cloudy, 50s and dripping rain in Chicago. And here it was pushing 100 degrees. Anyway, so then I brought, fast forward 10 years or so, my wife and I are trying to decide where to go on vacation. And from her mother, she inherited sort of a fondness for the Southwest. They used to go to New Mexico, but I said, well, let's go try Tucson. And so we came here and stayed up at El Conquistador and drove up and down the Oracle Road corridor eating Mexican food. Anyway, so she fell in love with it.
Yeah.
And then we got to get out of here, pretty rapidly led to my finding a job at going from a big company up north of Chicago to a little tiny startup in Tucson. But anyway, I took the risk, and we never regretted it. So that's how I got to Tucson. Stayed here 5 years before that company got bought by a company in San Diego. So I got relocated to San Diego for 13 years. That's when I started doing the soul jazz.
Well, let's talk about that. The cats that I'm familiar with at that time, and some of them have left us, but Mundell Lowe, Jack Costanza, the bongo man, and then Charles McPherson was out there. Now this is more like stone jazz, but talk a little bit about the soul jazz environment, how you fell in there.
Well, before I get to that, I should say that our son Tommy was born in 1989, so he's now in his early 30s. But he started expressing interest in guitar. My wife hooked him up with Ed DeLucia, who you probably know.
Great player. Yeah.
And they had a very symbiotic relationship, and Ed really got him off to an early start at a young age.
You can't have a better teacher than that.
No, and so, I still hear Ed's playing and what Tommy does. But anyway, Tommy went on to go to Berkeley, followed by New England Conservatory.
He went to both?
He went to both, so he ended up with a master's in jazz performance or something like that. Anyway, so he's
cooking. He's cooking right now.
Well, and about the age of 15, he became a much better player than I ever was on guitar. But so we would sit here in the living room. My wife, Carol, would encourage us to turn on the drum machine. I learned how to do simple left-hand bass and play rhythm up here while Tommy jammed out.
Oh my God, that's great. That's great.
That was really the beginning of the soul jazz stuff. And so the kind of stuff we were doing there was from Grant Green and I think Dave Stryker and Jack McDuff, and that was about the extent of my
That's pretty deep, man. That's not bad at all.
And eventually got to Jimmy McGriff, Jimmy Smith, and Dr. Lonnie Smith stuff. So I had this whole repertoire starting off kind of with Tommy, and then before too long, Tommy moved east and was there most of the time. But when he would come home, then we would do some of the same thing. But then separately, this drummer that I knew there named Marley Walk, who said, hey, you and I should get something together playing this kind of music that I hear you diddling on. And so I said, yeah, good idea. And he says he's got a guitar player that plays kind of in the George Benson style, and that was, of course, one of Jack McDuff's early guitar player. That's where George Benson cut his teeth.
You're darn right.
I saw George Benson being interviewed, YouTube of him being interviewed recently, and he was talking something about how Jack McDuff was always getting on his case to play it differently, and he finally figured out what the secret was to getting Jack off his case, which was play more blues style. And so that's what Jack wanted. Anyway, so Marley and I got this thing together, and there was this club down on the north side of San Diego, in North Park, called 7 Grand Whiskey Club, and they had a nice stage in the back. And, you know, it was amazing. We ended up with kind of a monthly thing there, and what amazed me was it was full of people like 20 somethings, and they were digging on the music.
What year is late 80s or when was
So
it?
this would have been, we moved to San Diego in 2003. So
Oh, wow.
this would have been about 2012, 2013. So now we're getting into some kind of recent history.
Right.
But
Yeah, so there was a young vibe.
yeah, I mean, and we were playing this, you know, really blues based stuff with fancy chord extensions. Like
Let's can you want to sample show give an example of what you kind of the vibe.
Well, you know, one of my favorites is Dapper Dan by
You busted
by
that out at
Dr.
Cinco,
Lyman
yeah.
Fin-
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, there you go.
Yep.
Let's get our right sound here. And it goes to the 4 and goes on from there. And eventually I gotta get to
Yeah.
how Brian Dean and I hooked up.
We'll get
on-
it all,
on this
yeah.
stuff. But
So you felt comfortable to be able to play the kind of tunes the younger cats were digging that soul jazz.
yeah, and so eventually Marley moved on to something else, and this soul jazz gig evolved into really me managing that gig, which was monthly at 7 grand. We had a few other things from time to time, but that was a regular thing, which
Right.
really helped solidify things. But it evolved to where I had a roster of guitar players and drummers, and so for the next gig, I would, you know, see who was available and all that. So we had a fairly constantly rotating set of guitar players and drummers. And the reason that's important, actually, I purposely set it up that way as opposed to having members that felt like they were committed full-time members of the band, for a very specific reason, which was
Yeah.
I wanted Tommy to be the guitar player whenever he came back to town, which he did, you know, like holiday season and maybe once or twice a year. So, and really those...
Was he gigging in back east, or was he pursued a career in music?
Well, yes and no. The answer is that Carol and my thought were, we want to support him because he's really dedicated. I mean, he's in his room, you know,
Shedding,
11
yeah.
years old, figuring out Jimmy Page fast riffs and stuff like this, and Van Halen stuff. So we said, all right, we're going to support Tommy in this because he's really dedicated, and this is really what he wants to do. And his expression was, I just can't imagine doing anything else. So he said, okay, we'll support you in that, but it's a rough world out there. You not only got to be good playing music, but which I think he qualifies pretty well for that. But you also got to be relentless self-promotion
Totally.
and willing to take a bunch of hard, and that's not really his personality. So
Most artists, I mean, why should they have to wear 8 hats? They have to, though. Yeah.
yeah.
So he had to get something to augment the.
And so there he is in Boston at Berkeley and NEC, but Carroll helped him line up all these courses at MIT, Boston University. I think maybe even took something at Harvard. But anyway, these are extension courses. First it was math. So he was taking all these high-end math courses while studying jazz music, one course at a time. Then he hit on a computer science course, and he really resonated with that. So he kind of switched over and augmented all that with Coursera and different kind of things he could do at home. Anyway, so he ended up going to online master's program at Georgia Tech. I mean, he only went to Georgia once because he's doing all this in Boston, and then later after NEC he moved to New York. So he ended up with a master's degree in computer science. So that's now his day job at a small company, defense contractor company outside DC.
Wow.
But he's playing a lot of jazz.
Great. Great.
Seems like 8 or 10, 12 gigs a month. He's all doing this.
But he doesn't have to sing for his supper on the bandstand, which is so freaking hard.
That's right. And I think he now realized, even though he bemoans the fact that that he can't just focus on it full time because he's got the day job, and it's a really great company too. They're all about work-life balance and things like that, and so
they're conscious of the fact that there's a life outside of work.
So that's the yes and no answer to is Tommy playing music, not for a living, but he's doing it quite a bit. In fact, we're flying out there this Saturday to see him. Yeah.
Well, Doc, I this is important. I just, music has not always been as significant for me as it has been in the last 5 years. I've been on my trip as a journalist for the last 12, and I just wanted you to talk about. I mean, Pharoah Sanders was putting out a lot of tunes that related to this at a certain period in our history, but I wanted you to just talk about how music has been a healing force in your life.
Well, I would say, here's one way to put it.
Yeah.
You